No.
Shabbat Shalom and Happy Hanukkah, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
Well, I see some new people on the Zoom today. Greetings to everybody near and far. I know some people who are on the Zoom are not nearby. And those who are here, both our regular visitors and our beloved guests who are with us today. Usually I do a sermon about now. But as I thought of Hanukkah, and I'm not bad at doing sermons. I may not be the best, but I'm certainly not the worst. But I find as I began to read about Hanukkah in the New Covenant, in John chapter 10, I began to see that perhaps I should be teaching more the way Yeshua was teaching. Yeshua was teaching in stories, in parables. He was telling things that people would remember in story form. And so I thought about a story I had told about 5-6 years ago. And it's the first century witness and account of Hanukkah. Now, Joseph was a man rejected by his own brothers. He was enslaved, imprisoned. And he rose to such a high position in Egypt, he was like a king. He was called by another name, Zephanath Paneah, meaning the hidden treasure. His own people, his own family didn't recognize him, as Reb Andy pointed out in his mini drash. There was a man who lived in Israel thousands of years ago, and he saw with his own eyes, as they say in Argentina, Dankeschön. Ooh, that's the good stuff. And this man who lived in Israel thousands of years ago, he saw with his own eyes another one like Joseph, a king who was not recognized by his own brothers, his own people. They rejected him. And this man was a witness. And this is his story. The following words are not mine, but his. I was born in the northern part of Galilee in Israel, some 10 years after the Romans began what is called the Common Era. Although I am now an old man, it was not so long ago that I celebrated Hanukkah as a child. I remember the splendor and wonder of lighting candles each night, the joy of playing dreidel, or in Hebrew, sevivon, and the telling of the story which was so fresh in the minds of all who lived in Israel. I remember how my father would gather the children around him after the candles were lit, and he told us of how Matthias, the priest, refused to dishonor God and the Torah. And his son Judah Maccabee took up arms against the Greeks, and although outnumbered 10-1, defeated them. On the 25th of Kislev, 167 years before the Common Era, they marched into Jerusalem and reclaimed the Temple Mount for our God and for his people. The war had been fought long and hard. The people did not even have the opportunity to celebrate Sukkot, the festival of tabernacles. And when the temple was rededicated to our God, our leaders felt that it was appropriate to honor him by celebrating the 8-day-long feast at that time. Sukkot is that holy day which causes us to remember the concept of Emmanuel, God with us. And God had been with us. He went before us in what was the greatest battle since Joshua led Israel against the peoples of Canaan. My grandfather told me that some even expected the Messiah to enter Jerusalem on the last day of the celebration. And even when I was a child, there were still those who would pray for the Messiah to come, not only at Sukkot, but at Hanukkah as well. Unfortunately, the sovereignty of our land was not to last. Eventually, the Romans came and gained control over this land, which is holy to our God. And they removed our chosen king and replaced him with one who was not even descended from David. This man, whom they called Herod the Great, was actually no king at all, but a mere servant of pagans. And yes, he did build what came to be known as the Second Temple, or improved upon it. But what distinguished him from other rulers before him was his cruelty and his abusiveness towards his own subjects. As Rome's puppet, Herod assured his own comfort by exacting heavy taxes from the Israelites and to send to the emperor Caesar Augustus. Rome had a unique way of collecting taxes. Caesar wanted to ensure that no one was left out of this grand Roman tradition. And to this end, they decreed that a census be taken. And such a measure required every family to return to its own town of origin for the recording and the paying of the tax. Pragmatic as they were, the most efficient time for this census taking was during the high holy days and during Sukkot, when the people were gathering their families together for worship. My mother once told me of such a year when she was a young woman, about the 4th or 5th year before the Common Era. She was so looking forward to celebrating Sukkot in Jerusalem with her family, and she and her brothers spoke of how they would stand in awe of the priests and Levites as they emerged from the temple. Each year at that time, they would descend the Temple Mount to the pool of Shiloh, where the high priest would draw out a pitcher of water. And as they ascended the steps of the temple, the Psalms of Ascent, which are Psalms 120 to 134, would be sung by the musicians and singers. A crowd of thousands would join in the dancing and the worship of our God. Each would pray that perhaps this year, that the Messiah would come. I remember the Hallel Psalms. They were the first that I learned as a child. I will lift my eyes to the mountains, from whence comes my help. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to slip. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not smite you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will protect you from all evil. He will keep your soul. The Lord will guard your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forever. But Herod the Great ruined the high holidays for my mother's family that year, and for all Israel as well. Rather than meet the family caravans on the way to Jerusalem, each male was instructed to return to his ancestral city for the recording of the census and paying of the tax. The joy of the season was all but gone. Many families did not even have enough left over to continue on to Jerusalem for worship. They were taxed to the max. I hear that there was one man, a doctor, a man by the name of Luke, who has recorded this event so that none would forget. My mother told me that a year or so later, just when we thought the situation could get no worse, an edict was issued by King Herod that all male children 2 and under in and around Bethlehem were to be killed. This order was given due to the words of some astrologers. These wise men from the east had come in search of a child king, and Herod feared for his throne, no doubt. When word of this travesty spread throughout Israel, even the women in the Galilee, in the north of Israel, feared for the lives of their children who were at Herod's mercy. That year in our history has been one of some of the rabbis considered the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy, where Jeremiah said, "A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children. And she refused to be comforted because they were no more." How many great and righteous men would have come from Judah had Herod never lived. I remember only a few times as a child making the journey to Jerusalem for the High Holy Days. My family was poor. Although somewhat trained in the Torah, prophets, and writings, my father, who desired to be a Pharisee, followed in the footsteps of his father and became a baker. We had little time for travel or family gatherings. What I do remember are the years when Abba did well. Those years at Hanukkah, my brothers and I would each get a new dreidel made of wood. Abba would tell us of the times when reading of the Torah had been forbidden, and the young men would study the Bible scrolls until a Greek soldier came by. And then they would quickly hide the scroll, bring out the dreidel, and pretend to be engrossed in a game of tops. When the soldier left, the Torah study would resume. And of course, Abba told us of the story how when the temple was captured from the Greeks, and that there was only enough oil to light the temple menorah for one day. God, however, provided a miracle, and the lamp did not go out for 8 days. I also remember my father telling us about the Hanukkah lights, especially about the shamash, the serpent candle, the flame which is used to light the other branches of the menorah. Abba said that the shamash flame represents God, and the rest represent those who have faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As common people, we have no true light of our own, but God gives us his light and his life. Those who accept this gift of life from God have their place secured in the world to come. As we say in Hebrew, the Olam Haba. Abba would also tell us that those who do not know God have a responsibility. That those of us who do know God have a responsibility to share this gift of life with other people. I was not what you would call a model child. My mother said that I would cause more trouble than a goat trapped in a potter's shop. I once overheard my father wondering out loud how long I would rebel against his authority. There came a time in my life, however, in my late teens, when I started to consider the words my father spoke concerning the Torah and the prophets. I distinctly remember thinking one day, just as a fresh batch of challah bread came out of the oven, that if all these teachings are truly the words of God to men, so what? What do they mean to me? Of what consequence is there to me how I live my life if these words are true? If I say I believe in the Bible, how then should my life be different from that of the pagans? Even if some of the Greeks and Romans lived moral lives, could there be any more? I returned to my studies, long since put aside, and reread the words of Isaiah the prophet, Yeshayahu. He wrote that we are all like sheep, and we have gone astray from God. He also said that our sins are as red as crimson, but God would forgive them, making them white as snow. And I pored over the words of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, who prophesied that someday God would make a new covenant with the house of Judah and the house of Israel. And he would write his Torah upon our hearts, and he would forgive our sin. And I thought, would he forgive my sin? Could these words really be true? How? How could I know for sure? What do these words have to do with a poor unknown boy from Galilee? And the air was crisp with the first hints of winter coming to Israel. And the shepherds have already moved their flocks from the highlands to the valleys for winter pasture. And around the 10th day of Kislev, December on the Roman calendar, I gave leave of my father. I told him that I would like to make the journey to Jerusalem for Hanukkah, the feast of dedication. I explained to him that if this is the time each year when Israel celebrated the Maccabean victory, when God demonstrated his love, sovereignty, and provision for his people, perhaps this year, he would provide me with the answers to my own personal battles. I arrived in Jerusalem on the 24th of Kislev. That evening was the first night of Hanukkah. I was staying with a family which had been close to mine for generations. And at their bidding, and due to the severe cold, I refrained from venturing out to the temple for the first 2 evenings. We lit the candles, and we told embellished stories of the Maccabees and played dreidel with the children. By the third night, I could just not contain myself. I felt drawn to the temple. Pulled, drawn, I had to go. I had so many questions and so few answers, and even on that night, God dwelt with his people in the temple. Hundreds of Pharisees and rabbis had come for the celebration to teach and to gain new disciples. Surely between the presence of God and the abundance of teachers, I could find the way. And when I arrived, the wind had come up and was howling through the columns and porticos of the temple. Most of the rabbis and their disciples had gone inside. Others huddled together to provide some warmth in numbers. I did not feel right intruding on what appeared to be closed discussions. I remember from a previous visit to the temple that on the east side near Solomon's porch was somewhat sheltered from the weather. And as I made my way, I noticed a young rabbi. And he was walking as he taught. And his disciples appeared to be hanging on every word he spoke. I felt I had seen him somewhere before, but few of the great teachers made it far of the north as to Galilee and our small village. And as I joined the small group and listened, I found myself lost in his words. His teaching was somehow different than that of the other rabbis I had heard before. He spoke of the deep and living faith of Abraham, of the humble obedience of Moses, and of the grace of God towards to have mercy and forgiveness towards his children. And as the evening progressed, the number of people listening to this unique teacher was growing, even though it was getting colder. One who stood close to him asked a question as we all listened. He said, "Teacher, when we were here at this very place at the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, you spoke to us words which are difficult to understand. Will you tell us again?" And the rabbi stopped where he was, and he said in a voice filled with a compassion that I had never heard before. He said, "I will tell you again. If a man is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scriptures say, from his innermost being shall flow rivers of living water." After a pause, he pointed to the Hanukkah menorah. And that were near the temple wall. The shamash and the 3 other flames illuminated each one. And he said, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." This man spoke with an authority like no other. I knew that from this man I would find the answers to my own questions. He continued to use metaphors to explain who he was. His teaching was at the same time difficult and wonderful. And as I looked around me, it was evident that others were feeling the power of his words as well. And some began to sit at his feet. Still others were becoming nervous, their anxiety distracting. And suddenly one man from the crowd stood up and yelled, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us so plainly." "I told you, and you do not believe," he answered. "The works I do in my Father's name testify on my behalf, but you do not believe because you are not included among my sheep. My sheep listen to my voice, and I recognize them. They follow me, and I give them eternal life. They will absolutely never be destroyed, and no one will snatch them from my hands. My Father who gave them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them from the Father's hands. I and the Father are one. Seconds passed like years. The words of this young rabbi went through me as a sword, plummeting through my heart as if cutting it in two. This man had made himself out to be God in the flesh. In my heart, I believed each word. On the other hand, my mind doubted. One who would have the audacity or lunacy to make such a proclamation on this holy ground. And those on the outer rim of the crowd seemed to retreat. They soon returned carrying stones. Others had simply looked down to grab what was scattered at their feet. If he was lying, or if he had gone mad, there was only one way for the crowd to respond to such a claim. Someone handed me a rock. It was cold, biting cold in my hand. The jagged edges seemed to cut into my hand as he cried out, "I showed you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you stoning me?" At first, no one answered. And then a well-known and respected rabbi pushed his way to the front. "We are not stoning you for any good deed," he stated with restrained anger, "but for blasphemy, because you, who are only a man, are making yourself out to be God." And although the younger man replied, I could not concentrate on the exchange of words occurring in front of me. All I could do was look into the eyes of this one who claimed to be the very Son of the living God. All at once, they were filled with truth and love and peace, and even forgiveness for those who would strike him down in moments. Surely this man was either the greatest liar ever to be seen in Israel, a lunatic unaware of what he was saying, or he was the exact representation of God come to earth. And then he said, "If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. But if I do them, though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand once and for all that the Father is in me, and I in the Father." The rock fell silently from my hand. No one moved. It was though every man there was struggling with each word this rabbi spoke. And some began to raise their arms in preparation to carry out the judgment. But strange, just in a moment, he was just gone. I saw the young rabbi about a week later. I had taken the longer way home through the Jordan Valley. And this way wound around the time to think and to pray about the things revealed to me that cold night at the temple. And there was a small group of people gathered at the water's edge. And I recognized some as the disciples who were with him at the portico in the temple, and others who had gathered as well, not to ridicule as before, but to listen and to learn. They called him by name. They called him Yeshua. And as I listened, he said that he had come to bring an abundant life to all those who would believe in him. Once, after he had answered a question concerning the sacrifices, he turned to look straight at me, and he said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Well, the next spring, just after Passover, I heard that his teacher had been judged by the Pharisees as a blasphemer and a heretic. His teacher. And then executed by the Romans. And his followers say that he rose from the dead, and they are living out his teachings to this day, awaiting his return. And the years which have passed since then have been filled with many unanswered questions from my people. The temple has been gone now for about 2 years. There will be no more festive Hanukkah celebrations in Jerusalem. No more joyful worship at Sukkot. No more sacrifice at Yom Kippur. It's a dark time for the Jewish people. So many questions. The rabbis try to answer, but no human answer is sufficient to explain what God has allowed to come upon Israel. Do I still celebrate Hanukkah? Of course. I help my grandchildren light the flames of the menorah and recite the blessings each night and pray for the restoration of our people and the land. And I tell them, as my father told me, about the shamash flame and how it represents the light of God, which is given to those who believe. But I can tell them the whole story. I met the shamash. I met the servant candle, the Messiah, who was sent from God and did a great miracle in me. He gave me his light, and he also gave me his life. You see, in Yeshua is life. And that life is the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, and it never will. Shabbat Shalom, and Happy Hanukkah.